Russia has a serious problem. A problem that means that whatever they accomplish in the short term from their war with Ukraine, if they can even accomplish it, they cannot in the long term win the broader geopolitical conflict that they have now started. What is that problem, you might ask? Russia is literally running out of people. That's not meant figuratively or in an exaggerated sense. Instead, it is factually true that Russia is literally running out of people faster than the country can replace them, and has been for quite a while. That's having a devastating effect on Russia's prospects for the future, something which is only going to get worse over time, and which is being dramatically accelerated by Russia's war against Ukraine to irreversible levels. You see, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia's population has been plummeting from a combination of long-repressed citizens leaving the country as soon as they could, and a fertility rate far below replacement level, and far below the global average. Since then, the trends have only accelerated. In 2024, the average Russian woman now has just 1.5 children versus the 2.2 that would be required just for the population to replace itself, let alone to grow in any meaningful way. And even worse, a huge percentage of young Russians now plan on leaving the country and moving abroad as soon as they can, rapidly accelerating the problem. It's a big deal because population collapse means that a country can no longer sustain itself due to a lack of workers and a decreasing tax base that makes it impossible to fund pensions for retirees, among many other problems. Put bluntly, when a population decreases at a sufficient scale, a society can rapidly decay from the inside out, regressing instead of making progress. This is now happening to Russia. And while the war in Ukraine has made this crisis worse, the crisis itself is based on provable data, studies, and trends that predate Russia's full-scale invasion. Now, with Russia sending a large percentage of the country's young men to their deaths, while causing huge numbers of other young Russians to flee the country to avoid mobilization, Russia's population crisis is becoming more catastrophic each and every day. Even more than that, those who have managed to stay in Russia and avoid the war are now less hopeful for the future, for obvious reasons, and therefore less inclined to start young families, causing the fertility rate to plummet to some of its lowest levels ever, even lower than they were during World War II, a data point showing that many Russian people are even more hopeless today than they were under Soviet communism, at least when it comes to bringing more children into the world. Perhaps because, unlike in Soviet communism, the average Russian now has the ability to access information via the internet, to know how bad things really are, and what good alternatives exist outside of their borders, even if they can't do much about it. To put the current Russian fertility rate of 1.5 births per woman in perspective, this is even lower than it was 100 years ago in 1923, a year when only 1 in 5 Russian boys being born would survive until their 23rd birthday, due to war, famine, disease, and state-sponsored executions. Put another way, if you were a boy born in 1923, you only had a 20% chance of surviving to your 23rd birthday. A sobering statistic. But still, throughout this entire period of mass casualties and general despair, fertility rates in Russia remained significantly higher than they are today. In most years, more than double the current rate. Our hats off to Vladimir Putin. You have to work really hard as a government to make people feel more hopeless about having children today than they did while undergoing that. Back to the population collapse itself. Today, Russia is running out of people so quickly that in the coming generations, demographic experts predict that Russia will not have sufficient young men to keep their economy running at the level required of a developed nation, let alone have enough men left over to fight in future wars of massive attrition, as has always been the Russian style of warfare. This will make Russia's goal of breaking out of its developing nation status and becoming a developed nation almost completely impossible for the foreseeable future. But it gets even worse. The thing about population collapse is that it's exponential, meaning the rate at which population collapses only gets faster the more that time goes on. And according to many experts, Russia is now nearing the peak of the precipice where things will fall off a population cliff. This, of course, is not Russia's only problem. Currently, in fact, they have several other catastrophic problems. For example, Russia is currently having existential problems with its military, leading to poor performance on the battlefield in Ukraine over the past 2.5 years. We have several videos about that. Russia also has extreme economic problems that are threatening to make the nation insolvent in the long term, stemming from sanctions placed upon them due to their invasion of Ukraine. We have videos about that, too. And related to the first two problems, or perhaps the cause of them, but also branching out to touch nearly every other level of Russian society. Russia also has systemic leadership problems stemming from deep-seated corruption, a predominant force at nearly every level of the Russian government. And yes, we have videos about that, too. But the thing is, all of these other problems have one thing in common. They are at least theoretically reversible, and could have a chance at being fixed relatively quickly if Russia stopped its war today, and the people of Russia demanded real change. But Russia's population problem, the fact that they are running out of people, is different. It's much deeper and much more serious, because there is no apparent way to reverse it, and therefore, it may no longer be fixable, even in a best-case scenario. And that's not for lack of effort on the Russian side. To that point, before the naysayers predictably chime in and claim that Russia is strong, perhaps even invincible, and that any statements about Russian dilemmas or Russian weaknesses can only come from Western propaganda, it must be understood that the source of these dramatic statements about Russia's population collapse has not come from any Western governments. Instead, this information has come from the Russian government itself, which has been acknowledging this problem for many, many years, a significant fact in and of itself, since Russia has almost always officially downplayed any of its national plights, underreporting wartime casualties, overreporting energy incomes, and things like that. Russia's demographic problem, though, is apparently bad enough that even the Kremlin doesn't attempt to fully hide it, perhaps even indicating that it's far worse than has even been reported. For example, in 2018, Vladimir Putin himself even made the following statements, which can be found by anybody on the Kremlin's official website, word for word. Every 25 to 27 years, a significantly lower number of people in Russia enter adulthood, when they can start families and raise children, than there could and should be. In the long term, if we act indecisively now, this may threaten the stability of our society, and consequently, our country's security. In fact, for most of Putin's presidency, this demographic problem has been at the top of his list of national problems to solve. And in 2021, just before Putin ordered his invasion of Ukraine, he told a reporter that this demographic crisis was his number one anxiety. We can't think of any bigger irony than that. Putin did try several things to fix Russia's demographic crisis, even beginning an aggressive policy of repopulation, publicly stating that increasing the population will be one of the major Russian goals in the coming decades. And despite the fact that Putin himself only has 2 children that he has been willing to publicly acknowledge, perhaps with 2 additional unacknowledged children from his mistress, he has now begun calling for all Russian women to start having 8 or more children in an attempt to, I quote, preserve old traditions. But unfortunately, by old traditions, Putin seems to mean imperialism, and the ability to throw waves of impoverished peasant soldiers into warfare to subjugate the nations surrounding Russia for the power and profit of the Russian elite. I say that tongue-in-cheek, because despite his publicly stated anxieties, Putin has not only acted indecisively to fix Russia's demographic problems, but he has actually acted decisively in the exact wrong direction, by intentionally creating the only circumstances that are guaranteed to make a demographic problem worse, starting a massive war with Russia's next-door neighbor. This war, in turn, has resulted in over 500,000 Russian casualties, and between several 100,000 to up to 1 million Russians fleeing the country. We have to appreciate the irony, Putin claiming he can't sleep at night because of a declining demographic, and then proceeding to trigger literally every single event that would cause the demography to further decline. Case in point, when Russia started the war, they had just around 7 million men in their 20s. Counting those 500,000 casualties we've just mentioned, most of them among younger men, and several 100,000 additional young men fleeing the country to avoid mobilization, Russia still has perhaps around 6 million able-bodied young men left, which is a potential reduction of over 15% in just 2 years, from a number that was already drastically too small. This makes the exponential population decline that Russia was already experiencing even worse. The problem is so bad that many experts have estimated Russia will lose the ability to conduct major offensives within 6 to 10 years, meaning that however the war in Ukraine goes for Russia, it could be the last war they're able to conduct for a good long while, at least of this kind. We'll return to that thought in just a moment. That's tragic for Russia, but good for the rest of the world. But even worse for Russia, these young men aren't just needed to fight wars. They're also needed to work for Russian companies, to pay taxes to the Russian government, and to have families of their own to give Russia their future children, and, bluntly stated, their entire future. Creating gaps like this is very, very bad for a society, as has already been demonstrated by the missing Russian generation from World War II, which still produces massive holes in the Russian population every 25 years or so, when those who died would have had children coming of age, and then grandchildren, and then great-grandchildren, and so on. People who should have existed, but never did. These gaps, and the broader impacts they have, are part of what has contributed to the general social dissatisfaction that has led Russians to be supportive of something as dramatic as the invasion of Ukraine. But beyond that, one specific reason this is so bad for Russia is because young men are critically needed due to the way Russia's pension system works. Pensions can only keep going when the older retirees who are withdrawing from their pensions today are having their withdrawals sufficiently replaced by younger workers who are paying into the system. But when a huge number of those young men disappear, or even worse as far as the pension system is concerned, are disabled in battle and turn into net drawers on social care instead of net contributors, the pension problem gets really, really bad, really, really fast. And in the future, it's highly unlikely that a significant number of Russians will ever be able to retire. Unfortunately, rather than making Putin back down, these demographic facts only appear to be making him more aggressive, with an apparent use them while you've got them attitude. Having given up on fixing the demographic problem, and knowing that this war is his last chance to use what's left of Russia's young population to secure the geopolitical status he desires in his lifetime. Some have even speculated that the invasion of Ukraine was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort to boost Russia's population by conquering Ukraine and adding its territory and its people to Russia's numbers. But I would take a more nuanced view than that. I don't think Putin would go to war to improve demography, because Putin only cares about demography because of its ability to grow long-term power. Demography is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. So Putin wouldn't risk power to fix demography, but he might risk demography to gain power. I remain convinced that Putin is at war right now, at least partially because of a use them while you've got them attitude, hoping to use young Russian men's lives while he still has them to use. The main remaining question is, how long will the Russian people tolerate this? Now to dive deeper into the underlying reasons behind Russia's demographic problem, I encourage you to watch these videos to learn why Russia's shambled economy is preventing young people from wanting to start families they don't think they can afford, or to learn about why the Russian military performance has been so poor, leading to so many casualties. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you on the next video.